I do have something that I want to say that I think is really important. And I want to tell you about a guy in the Bible named Josiah. Josiah is found in 2 Kings starting at chapter 21. And we're not going to do a lot of reading. I'm just going to tell you the story and then we'll look at a couple of verses. Josiah's dad was an evil son of a gun. Josiah's grandfather was an evil son of a gun. And when I say evil son of a gun, Israel at this time, they kept on backsliding and worshiping other gods. Now, I didn't dig into this, but one of the gods that they would, so I'm not sure that this is the god they were worshiping this time, but one of the gods that they would worship was Moloch. And the way they would worship Moloch is they would literally take their newborn children and throw them in a fire. You can read about it in Jeremiah. The worship of these foreign gods in ancient Israel was ugly, ugly, ugly. And they would backslide, and they would keep on going back again and again and again. And God, and the prophets, you can read through the prophets of the Old Testament, God is saying, hey, if you guys return to me, I'll help you. There are stories in the Bible, like with Jehoshaphat, where kings did come back to God, and God did grant them peace. Well, Josiah's... Josiah's dad was not a godly man. He was an evil, evil king. And if you read through the Kings, one thing that you find repeatedly is that this person walked in the ways of his father David. Maybe this sounds familiar to you. Or this king did not walk in the ways of his father David. Oops. And that was the standard. David was the standard that all the kings were measured up to, okay? And so King Josiah, 2 Kings chapter 22. Come on, work with me here. All right. Here it comes. All right. So here's what's happening. Josiah becomes king at 8 years old. He becomes king, all right? Now, right away, the Bible doesn't tell us this, but there must have been a mentor of some kind in Josiah's life. Because Josiah, from the time he was 8 years old, begins to make godly decisions, okay? And so he's 18 years old, and we pick up in verse 10. Shaphan also told the king, Hilkiah, the priest, has given me a scroll. So Shaphan read it to the king, and when the king heard what was written in the book of the law, he tore his clothes in despair. So here's this 8-year-old kid. He's 18 when this happens. And he begins to see that something is missing from Israel. We've missed something. The worship of all these other gods, and there's something in this young kid's heart that yearned. There was something in this young kid's heart that looked around and said, there's got to be more than this. And so he does the only thing that he knows how to do. And he says, the temple of the Lord is in disrepair. And I know that we need to get back to God. And we miss something. Our glory days, we serve God. That when things are going good, we serve God. And so let's start to rebuild the temple. This is the symbol of God's blessing on our people. Let's begin to rebuild the temple. And so the workers go in, and you can read about this in the previous chapter, and they begin to rebuild the temple of the Lord. And this happens while Josiah is 8, 9, 10, 11. And when he's 18 years old, as they are working on the temple, they find something. They find an old scroll. I don't know if it had been walled off, or somehow in the construction process, they find this old scroll. And so they bring it out, and then they begin to read it to the king. And as the king hears what the scroll says, the Bible says that when he heard what was written in the book of the law, he tore his clothes in despair. I want to tell you that something unfortunate happens with generations, okay? One generation to the next, a lot can be lost. Remember the Israelites. They were the ones who had seen all of the great things happen in Egypt, and they crossed the Red Sea. But then they're standing at the next generation. They had never seen the power of God. And so they get mad at Joshua when it's time to go into Jericho. You can look in denominations and do a little church history. And you'll find that when a denomination first starts, what normally is the pattern is, there's a rip-roaring begin to that denomination. Okay? Whether it's Luther hanging his stuff on the wall of the church and separating from the Catholic Church, or the Methodist Church when John Wesley comes out of the Protestant movement and says there's more, or whether it's the outpouring of the Holy Spirit out of the Holiness and Wesleyan movement around the turn of the century, there's something that happens where there's a revival and an encounter with God. But then, if you look at church history, something happens both in nations, in churches, and with people. It's the same. There's an encounter with God that is it's a passionate encounter. It defies reason. And it causes people to rise up and do things that they wouldn't have otherwise done. They rise up and they give it all, and they take off and they give it all for God. And because they've had this encounter with Jesus that rocked their world. And then their kids are born, and their kids grow up in it, and then their kids' kids are born, and they grow up in it, and all of a sudden, that contact, that passion is lost. And all that is left is the ceremony and the tradition. Now I want to tell you that there is good things about tradition and ceremony. And growing up, I was real cynical of anything that was traditional. Real cynical of anything that was heavy on ceremony. And there was a guy and you actually get a few quotes from this guy pretty often, because he said some things to me in my life that were very challenging to me. And one time I think I was spouting off to him about how dumb I thought some tradition was. I don't quite remember what it was. And he said, Scott, there's nothing wrong with ceremony. Ceremony with meaning is one of the most powerful things that you will ever experience. But ceremony without the meaning takes you to some terrible places. And so there is something that happens where we begin to trade tradition for experience. We get to trade ceremony for an encounter with God. And you can come to church and you can go through the motions of the church and never actually put yourself in a position where God is able to convict you. Never put yourself in it. You're just going through the motions in your mind to someplace else. The ceremony has lost its personal connection for you. And we actually get to see this happen in 1 Samuel. Chapter 15, verse 22. What has just happened here, Saul is the king of Israel. Okay, God has given, and he's given King Saul the kingship. He gives Saul victory, and he says, Saul, this is one thing I want from you. I want you to go out and I want you to conquer these people. But here's the thing, Saul, I want you to kill all of them. I don't want you to leave anybody alive. Now, we can talk the theology of that some other time. Had Saul and David actually killed all the people God told them to kill, they may not have fallen in as much sin later, but that's not what we're looking at this for today, so I'm not going to go down that rabbit trail. So if you're interested in that, ask me at lunch, okay? So Saul is supposed to kill all of them. He doesn't kill all of them because he had lots of really good cattle. Okay? And then he has this idea, well, here's what we'll do. We brought the cattle, we'll sacrifice all this cattle and things to God, and then we'll obviously eat some of it too, but we'll sacrifice this. And so he starts doing this. Now he was told to kill everything, even the cattle, everything he was supposed to kill. He decides, he looks at that and he says, well, that's stupid, okay? Why would I kill everything? I'm not going to waste all these resources. And so then we pick it up in verse 22. Well, Samuel comes. Oh, I don't have this verse in here, but it's too cool not to tell you. I think it's verse 18 or 19. Samuel comes up and he says, hey, Samuel, what is this bleating of sheep in my ears? He's being sarcastic. Samuel, read Samuel, and you can hear sarcasm in his tone of voice pretty often. Okay, Jesse, is this all of your sons? Well, we're not sitting until you get them all here. He was irritated with Jesse right there. Okay, so Samuel, he's a cynical guy, right? And he says, what is all the bleating of sheep I hear in my ears? What's with all this? And then Saul comes out and says, well, Samuel, it was obvious that killing them all wasn't a good thing. So I'm sacrificing all of this to God. Okay, I'm giving all of this to God. And this is what Samuel replies. He says, what is more pleasing to the Lord? Your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice. Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice. Obedience is better than sacrifice. And so basically, Saul is going through the formality of worship. That's the way they worship God. They would sacrifice all this stuff. And Samuel comes back and says, God really isn't that interested in your stuff. Okay? God isn't that interested in how good you do things. What God is interested in is is listening to him. He's interested in your obedience. Now, was it wrong to be sacrificing? No. But all of a sudden, Saul is trying to get his sin behind the sacrifice. Do you hear this? He was supposed to get rid of it, but he wanted it. Okay? When they would sacrifice it, they would burn some of it, but they'd get to keep some of it. All right? And they'd have a celebration. And he wanted the party. Okay? And so God tells him to do one thing, and he says, well, I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to sacrifice instead. I'm going to dedicate all of this to God. Ceremony without meaning is dead. Tradition without meaning is dead. You can hide behind ceremony, you can hide behind tradition, and avoid the conviction of God. And when we have done that, now sometimes young people, and this was me, not that I'm as young anymore, but when I was younger, sometimes we get a little cynical of tradition and ceremony. Because one thing that young people, my kid will be the same, they rebel against what they perceive as hypocrisy. Well, you're saying all of this in church, but and we can get kind of cynical. And what I want to encourage you with today is that God wants you. He loves you. He wants a relationship with you first. And if you have grown up in a situation, and I think a lot of us live here, and there's some church in your background, okay? And maybe you've been coming to the Rock for a while, and you kind of like it. You enjoy the coffee and the donuts and the people, but you've been sensing something. I want to tell you, and I don't know how good a job I do with this all the time, but my hope is that on Sundays that you would look up here in this stage and see somebody that is passionately in love with Jesus, that wants God to have everything in my life. And I fail and I struggle and I get discouraged just like you do, but I hope that I get to be an example for something that you can see as good. And I want to tell you that until you are engaged with God and your Christian walk is based more on ceremony than it is a relationship with Him, it's always going to be mediocre and it's always going to feel kind of empty. If your Christianity feels empty to you, I think this is why. I think it's because you've been going through some motions and then you've been frustrated that those motions haven't yielded the results. And my challenge for you this morning is to take a step back and look at your life and say, God, have I given up obedience for formality? That's what Saul did. He gave up obedience for formality. He went through the formalities. He went to church, he did the sacrifices, he stood when he was supposed to stand, he sat when he was supposed to sit, but he was broken. And that irritated God so much. We're not going to read the verse, but that irritated God so much that was the moment that he lost the kingship. It's this conversation that Samuel has with Saul and says, because you didn't obey God, because you hid your sin behind a religious formality and wanted to pretend you were doing something for God when you weren't, because of that, the kingdom will be torn from you and given to another. And then it's just the next chapter. We see David getting anointed to be the next king of Israel. That's how seriously God takes this. And so what I want to encourage you with, these songs that we're singing today, a whole bunch of them, and they all have different histories, but the ones that you really stop and kick, most of those came out of the Pentecostal movement around the turn of the century in the 1920s and 30s. I saw a picture, it was a magazine that talked about heritage. And in this picture, there was 4 banjos on the worship team. It was a worship team from like 1920. There was 4 banjos in the Assembly of God worship team in the 1920s. And just so you know, we'll be receiving the offering in a couple of minutes if you want to begin to prepare for that. Which I should have said just a couple minutes ago, but we're going to, but that's okay. I might run you along like 4 minutes. I promise I'll be longer than that. But when this thing hit, the Assemblies of God was born out of this Pentecostal movement. It was a foot-stomping, rip-roaring, and people thought they were crazy because they were so passionate. You read, there were newspaper articles written about them, and over and over again, it was like, these people, they're nuts in how they worship. It's chaos in this place. And sometimes I feel like, and I wasn't there, I didn't grow up in that. And so I don't have that specific experience. And we try to do things pretty here. You know what I mean? Okay, you fail, horribly, Scott. Okay, I get that. But we try. We put the lights up to try to be good. We put microphones on the instruments. We try to do things that make it nice in here and whatever. But can I tell you something? All of this is nothing. The nice cushy seats are nothing, because when God shows up, it can be a hard bench and people respond. When God shows up, and so all of this is an attempt for you to encounter God. And none of this is none of church, the coffee, the donuts, all of that serves one purpose, and it's that I hope you come to a place where you are encountered with God. That we can cut through the ceremony, cut through the tradition. I hope to have some ceremony and tradition. To be honest with you, we could do better there. It's been too long since we've had communion, for one thing. We can do better, and I'll try to do better. But I want to tell you, if you're going to choose, tradition and ceremony is powerful. You know what to expect. There's a comfort in it. There's a symbolism in it. But if you're going to choose one or the other, which you don't have to choose one or the other, but God would rather have your heart than have your ceremony. He's not that impressed with ceremony. And so as we move forward in the service,